Good morning. Today I want to talk a little bit about the shadow and shadow work. It is absolutely something that comes up in the Course in Miracles. Jesus often refers to shadow figures, which is how you see your brother. But it's also something that comes up in other theories. Carl Jung talks a lot about shadow work and integrating the shadow. And the shadow can be seen as everything that you disown about yourself. Actually, you don't even see it as part of yourself. You see it as something that is not part of you. It's something you've absolutely rejected from your ego, from yourself, your small self, your separate identity. And I know that my practice, and a big part of my practice, is bringing the shadow back in, owning the shadow. It's not an easy process. It hasn't been easy. It's not easy. But it is absolutely one of the ways that I heal. And it might not be something that's suitable for everyone, but there could be some of us that really benefit from this work. How I've seen it in my process of A Course in Miracles is when I particularly dislike someone, when someone triggers me, there's certain associations, aren't there, that trigger us, certain characters in the dream that trigger us. And it's interesting because, for a long time, I'd sought for some kind of spiritual community to some extent, maybe a little bit below the radar, but I never really found it. And then when I found the Course in Miracles and I joined the group that I'm in, I felt a very strong connection to most of the people. There was a familiarity, and I could sense their passion for doing the work, which I also had. And for a while I expected these relationships to be very harmonious, because we all know what the Course teaches. We all know we have to take responsibility, etc., etc. So I was quite surprised when there's actually a lot of conflict in our group. I was surprised, and I also find it very funny. And the reason I hadn't really found a spiritual community before was that I found it all very rainbows and unicorns, love and light and manifestation. And it just didn't resonate with me particularly, because look at what's going on in the world and the pain of that. And I just couldn't quite align with that. I needed to look at the dark stuff, and I knew that. And the Course absolutely encourages us to look at the dark stuff. Possibly some of us have to do it more than others. I absolutely have to do it. And in the process of doing that, I've discovered a real cynical element of me. I'm very cynical. I don't always want miracles. I'm quite cynical. I really uncovered that part of my ego, which I do release. But there's absolutely conflict, and there's, you can have conflict not just in spiritual communities. You can have conflict in families, workplaces, train stations, bus stops. We can have conflict anywhere, can't we? We often come across situations that are triggering. And what I've discovered is what I'm triggered by often is characteristics that I have completely disowned in myself. And because I've disowned them so wholly, they trigger me. And it's been a brutal practice actually over the last few years, but now it's very freeing when I can do this, but it's taken me a while to come into it. But, you know, as Course in Miracles students, we're getting to know our egos. We're looking at all of our ego tactics, all of our ego habits, all of our mental habits. And yeah, one of mine, which we all absolutely have, but was very obvious to me, is, yeah, I can be quite judgmental. And very interestingly, not on the outside. On the outside, I would seem very non-judgmental, and that was something I prided myself on. But of course, deep down, as an ego, I'm extremely judgmental. And I'd be triggered by certain characters. And it was extremely painful, and it is extremely painful when it happens. Extremely painful, and I'm back in that super well-trodden path of victimizing someone or hating on someone, blaming someone, and it's such a well-trodden byway in my mind. It's so familiar to me as an ego that when I fall into that rut, it's just incredibly painful. It's so familiar. It's how I used to attack myself by attacking my brother. It's absolutely painful. I can't stand it anymore. And I'm intolerant of it, actually, because I know how distressing it is, and I know it's attacking and it doesn't help me or help anyone. I know I'm running amok as an ego, and these are my old habits, but you know, you can imagine it. We've really trodden these paths in our mind very well. You know, I'm running along kind of, you know, the edge of a mountain, and when I fall in deep, because the chasm is so deep that I've trod, you know. It's very painful to me when I go into ego, and I know it immediately. I can't stand it. But actually, in these moments, we're discovering something. We have the potential to discover something extremely powerful and helpful that can be absolutely essential to our healing if we're vigilant and if we're willing to see it like this. So I've got, you know, we all have certain enemies, don't we? We might not even call them enemies, frenemies, enemies, people that trigger you, however you want to see it, whatever you want to call it. We've got triggering people and even triggering situations, but let's focus on the triggering people for a moment. And it's really interesting to see what you're calling them. Like, what is it about them that's triggering you? And this isn't to make yourself more right, it's just a little bit of self-discovery. So what characteristics and attributes are you giving to that person that is triggering you? I'll give you an example. I have a friend that does certain behaviours, and she's someone that I let very close into my heart, and that's also worth saying. Sometimes our closest relationships are the most triggering, because we've let these associations into our heart, and that's helpful actually, because once an association is in your heart, it's harder to avoid. We get set up with these particular situations, don't we? And sort of situations that we can't get out of, or we don't want to get out of. You could see sort of the parent-child relationship could be an example of that, or familial relationships or partners. With certain associations, we let into our heart, or they come into our heart sometimes actually without us even wanting that. That was my case. But yeah, I trusted in Jesus that this was something very powerful and something I needed to go through for healing if I was willing, and I was willing. But some of the things I'd say about this person, they'd do certain things and I'd find them and when I looked for, what is it about this person that's triggering me? And it was words. One of them was, attention seeking. They're attention seeking. And I could go on. Then also other situations, they're demanding, they're needy. These are all the sorts of words that would come to me when I was triggered. And, my practice is, if I'm triggered, I just stop and I look at that. I look at what that's about, and I ask myself, one of my practices has become to ask myself, what words am I using to describe that person's behaviour? What is it about their behaviour that's triggering me? And then I get that word. And, I know mostly when I'm upset because it's something that I disown. I've got a judgment against that behaviour. I see that behaviour as bad. So like someone who doesn't, my older habits would be someone who, can't keep to time, someone who is always late, someone who is lazy, someone who talks too much, someone who's demanding and needy, and this person triggered that in me, but I'm very familiar with these triggers as well. If I look back, I can see patterns. I can see other friends where I, might have stayed friends with them, but I didn't like these certain attributes that they seemed to have triggered me, upset me. So they never knew these things. You can look at them now, they've come up again. You can look at them in a different way. You can use it for healing. And so it's interesting to look at these characters and the words that you attribute to them. What is it about their behaviour that's triggering you? And let's take, one that's familiar to me, this idea of being demanding, someone being demanding. And yeah, when I've looked at that, I go back to being a child, because although we've had many, many lives and stories, lots of made up stories over time about ourselves and what we think we are, it's useful to go back to the childhood, because it's as far back as we can actually remember as a human. Some of us can access and remember our past lives, but most of us can remember something about our childhood. So although it's not the first experience, you're absolutely just repeating patterns. You're just repeating patterns all the time. So it's useful to go back to your childhood sometimes and look at some of the lessons that you taught yourself there. And it can seem like my parents did X, Y, and Z, but actually the trick is to remember that you've decided everything that goes on in your experience, everything. You chose everything. So in my childhood, being demanding was not, and attention seeking was not acceptable. We had to behave. If I was too loud or too demanding or crying, we were shut up very quickly. It was not, and I think many of us have come from that. I mean, that's a very familiar human pattern, isn't it? There's nothing special in my childhood. But yeah, it was not acceptable to be demanding. Actually, you got told off for that. So I stopped being demanding, because you could get into trouble. You'd get a whack, it wasn't particularly violent, but certainly a smack here and there was not, was not uncommon. And you'd upset your parents. So I learned that being demanding and attention seeking was not acceptable. And so when I feel triggered by someone who's demanding and attention seeking, I can go back and see that, think about my childhood. I can go back and I can see, to me, I'm not blaming my parents, because, we can't really you can do blame for a while, but it won't help you. Taking responsibility for everything that's happened is what will help you. That's a process, but one we all have to get on with if we want to actually do some valuable, true healing here. So I've created these situations and where being demanding was not acceptable, because I don't believe that being demanding is acceptable. It's a really strong belief in me. And I might allow it with children. I work with kids. I do allow it with children, but with adults, and some adults I can cope with that with, actually, and some I can't. And it doesn't matter, it's where you're being triggered. Don't sort of justify it by saying it's just that particular person. It's that particular person is really giving you a very strong mirror. There's something about them that's super triggering, and they're here to help you. They are here to help you. And you can absolutely receive so much help from these difficult associations if you're willing. And it does involve having to go through a bit of emotional discomfort and taking responsibility for yourself and your thoughts. But it is one way of healing. So I see that now, this idea of being demanding and attention seeking is something I've absolutely I can't bear it. I don't allow myself to be that. But when I was thinking about neediness one time, and now this person is very needy, and I don't associate with being needy. I don't ask for very much. I'm quite independent. I don't need particularly close associations. I have done in the past, but now I don't particularly need that. And I didn't associate with being needy. But when I really looked at it, these are all things that I'm disowning that I actually am. And I try to find ways that I'm displaying that behaviour, just to own it a little bit to start with. And I could see, me judging that person as being needy, I was needing them to change. And that is a form of neediness. And so I could see how I was being needy, although it's something I totally do not associate with myself. Of course I am. And with this idea of being demanding, I totally don't associate myself with that. It's not an part of the ego that I celebrate. However, I know from my childhood that I wasn't allowed to be demanding, so I stopped being demanding, but I became slightly more manipulative or secretive, and that's a tactic that I have employed a lot. I was good at getting my own way, even discreetly, even seeming like I was doing nice things and being a very good team member at work, or I always had my eye on the prize, trying to get this project over the line, or and being a sort of a good manipulator, working behind the scenes, making sure everyone's getting on. These things can be positive in the world, right? It's things that we sort of value and prize as workers and team members and family members, etc. But there is an element of manipulation with that, and I realised that this sort of, although I couldn't be demanding, I became quite manipulative, like demanding behind the scenes. And I realised, man, there isn't a more demanding association than myself, actually. I'm extremely demanding. Although I really hide it, I am demanding. Like, I've been very, very tough on myself in the past. And I'm extremely demanding. Like, you couldn't almost meet anyone, an ego more demanding than me. And it's quite a revelation to really see that and own that. And so, yeah, a few days ago I was having this kind of attack thought about a friend. They're so demanding. And then I experienced the pain of that. When I'm projecting, it's extremely painful. So I started to, try to find ways to bring this back. And when I brought it back, the pain just disappears. It's not painful for me to own being demanding. It's not painful. There is peace in that. And that's all I really am interested in, is not feeling pain and not feeling peace. But, through coming free of pain through truth rather than hiding anything. That's a difference. But yeah, I want to be pain free, but by going through everything, not by hiding anything. And I invite all of us to try that. If there's associations that we find triggering, to look at that and see if that's something you've disowned in yourself. And the truth is, if we're one, this isn't really talked about in the course, and I haven't had this direct communication from Jesus, but I can feel him nodding along here. If oneness is true, there's also one ego, and you are all of that. There isn't an ego habit that isn't you. There isn't an ego habit or an ego attribute that isn't me. It's impossible. It's all me. I'm all the egos. I'm all the ego attributes you could possibly imagine. And some of those ego attributes are more obvious to me. And I might sort of, celebrate to some extent. Oh, I'm independent, or I'm caring, or I'm a good listener, or I'm a good communicator, or whatever. There's some things about the ego, the separate self, that we value and elevate. And equally, there's other parts of the ego that we totally submerge and repress. But you're all of those things. All of that ego is you. And in the course, Jesus does talk about shadow figures. And I'm starting to feel that all of these characters that I've projected are basically, or many of them, the rejected parts of myself, the rejected parts of my own ego. And it's me that's responsible for the Big Bang and the separation, the disintegration into thousands of parts. And I keep up this facade, this sort of, small ego, Amy, that I maintain and sort of manage. Actually, I'm all egos. There's not a character here that isn't me. And it can be something, that takes a moment to get your head around, to start associating like that. But I promise you, it's one of the ways out of pain, to see that all these characters and all these egos and all of these characteristics and attributes that you see out there are things that you have disowned in yourself and split off and hidden from yourself. And that shadow work is extremely helpful. If you're willing, if you're someone that has to overturn every stone, I don't want to have any hidden secrets anymore from myself. So owning the shadow can be a really helpful part of healing and a path to wholeness, to really own all of your shadow. And what you'll find is that the more you own your shadow, the less you'll see it out there. So your relationships seem to be in form, will become more harmonious, because you're not having to have, characters come up to you and tap you on the shoulder or slap you in the face and say, hey, this is you, this is yours. So things become more harmonious because you're owning everything. You don't need these characters to come and help you with the healing anymore, or to be tapping on your door to show you your healing opportunities. You're already doing it yourself. And that's very helpful too. Thank you so much.